Now I'm recorded. See, I was saying to Tiffany, I always forget to record it in the beginning, but then I get halfway through my introduction. So I'm Eileen Matola from Haverford Township Recreation Department. I think we have a good program for you tonight. This is with us is the EAC, they're our Environmental Action Committee. I know Joy's on this call. She put it together with Gwen Nolan from Mother Compost. And today we have the Director of Operations from Mother Compost. We have Tiffany Kennedy, who is going to share all her expertise on composting. I think she'll have an interesting program. What we're thinking is what makes most sense is that you put questions in the chat. At the end, she's going to go through, answer the questions that she hasn't answered in her presentation. And then if you have more questions, we'll probably unmute depending on numbers and to see how it goes, or maybe put the questions in the chat. In any case, I don't want to talk too long. I'm still getting some people out of the waiting room, but I'm going to hand it over to Tiffany. Again, Tiffany Kennedy from Mother Compost. And thank you everyone for joining us. Go ahead, Tiffany.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. So I'm going to just go over the basics of home composting with you guys today, and just a little bit more about me. So like she said, I'm the Director of Operations here at Mother Compost. For those of you who don't know, we are a curbside organics collection company that runs through the main line. So we operate in Haverford Township, but then also in Lower Merion Township, and out towards the Devon and Wayne area as well. I've been working there since 2016 and have been interested in composting and doing active compost things since 2017 when I was still an undergrad at Westchester University. I am super passionate about rescuing food waste from the landfill and finding new ways to create less waste. So whether it's involved with food or recyclables, I just try and live as zero waste as possible. And I'm always learning new and different ways, tips and tricks to make that a possibility. I'm also an experienced gardener. I ran a small school plot for Great Valley School District for a few years, and grew a ton of food for the school and the food bank there. So putting practical knowledge of using finished compost and then growing food with that. So I can answer some gardening questions if they come up as well. And so tonight we're just gonna, here's an outline for the class tonight. So what is compost and why do we do it? And then getting started at your house, how to set up and maintain a pile, and then what to do with our finished compost, and then diagnosing the issues that will occasionally arise, and to be kind of expected as if you're new composters, it's kind of an experiment. So issues do come up, and knowing how to handle them appropriately when they do is a good way to make sure your composting journey is a success. All right, so what is compost? People often interchange the words composting and compost. And so I just want to clear up what the two different words mean, because they are similar, but they are slightly different. And so when we're talking about compost and you're going to be, composting at your house, it's good to know the difference here on what they mean. So we've got composting, which is a verb. It's a process it's the natural process that speeds up the decay of organic materials. And this is done by creating ideal environments for the decomposition. And it includes 5 different components. So you can see they're listed down there at the bottom. You've got volume, temperature, air, moisture, and microorganisms. And all of those 5 components are needed for proper breakdown. So things may decompose without one or the other, but to create a finished compost product, which is then our compost noun, you need those 5 components. And so like I just said, compost is the noun. It's the byproduct of the composting process. And it's a nutrient-rich soil amendment that helps sequester carbon and return nutrients back into the soil. So compost, some people call it a natural fertilizer. Some people sometimes call it dirt. However, we want to stay away from that word dirt because that is actually dead and depleted soil, where compost is the opposite of that. It is crawling with microorganisms. It's got jam-packed with nutrients, and we add it to soil to regenerate it. And so just a quick overview of the 3 phases of composting. These are important in understanding how the compost process works. But as you know, if you're home composting, the phases of composting are important to understand, but you'll most likely go through the first and second phase. The third phase is less needed in a home compost system. So we've got phase 1, which is the mesophilic phase. And so that's the beginning of creating your compost pile. So you go from anywhere from 0 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And what happens is you're building your material here. So temperatures are increasing. And the most popular bacteria there is mesophilic bacteria, which is what gives it its name. Once we surpass the 115 degrees Fahrenheit and get into the 120 range, all the way up to 170, we are in the thermophilic phase. So again, named after the most popular bacteria, which would be thermophiles. And this is what's considered active composting. So this is the active breakdown, the active decomposition phase. Our bacteria are working hard to break down proteins and fats. And we've got fungi and these other cool microorganisms called actinomycetes, which degrade complex carbs and proteins. During this phase is when you'll experience, you should be seeing heat come off piles, so you'll see steam, and it's what is creating the active breakdown. So things will turn from food scraps and move into a soil-looking product. It's important to note here that the thermophilic phase ends at 170 degrees, because if you ever were to reach temperatures of 170 or higher, you would want to completely break down your compost pile immediately, because compost piles have actually been known to spontaneously combust if they get any hotter than that, which is a safety and fire hazard, which we don't want. But that is more of a concern for commercial composters, backyard composters. It would be very rare to see temperatures get that high in a backyard system. And then the third phase of composting is called curing. So this is where we just kind of let the compost sit. So it should be pretty much fully decomposed and turned into soil at this point. And we just let the compost mature. So there's lots of temperatures going on in phase 2. There's lots of different microorganisms and active chemical reactions happening doing the breakdown. So during this curing phase, we let compost sit and settle. So there's less bacteria and microorganisms happening, but that's actually kind of what we need. We need them to decrease just a little bit so that when we go to apply compost, these chemical reactions have ceased, and the microorganisms aren't too much and won't overwhelm the plant system that you put them on. And so again, like I said, this is kind of optional for home composters, because once again, it is unlikely that you would see such high temperatures in a home pile. So the curing phase is kind of optional for home composters. It's always a good idea to let your compost sit a little bit, but most likely if you're home composting, it's been breaking down for a good amount of time, you're normally able to just take material and put it right into your beds or lawns or whatever you're using your compost for. All right, and so then why compost? So now we know what composting is, we know what the process is, we know the phases that it goes through. to create a finished product. And then it's important to understand why compost, because as you go through this home composting journey, it can get hard, it's time consuming, and you need to stick to it. If you don't stick to it, you won't really get a finished product. So it's important to come back to that why compost, why are you doing this? And so there's a ton of different reasons. You can save money and resources. You know, if you're an avid gardener and you're creating your own compost, you don't have to then go and buy that at the end or at the beginning of the season. You can also save money on your trash bill if that's something that you pay for, because you can be putting out less and less trash if you're diverting materials from your trash into the compost bin. Approximately 30 to 40% of our waste can be composted instead of sent to the landfill. So you could be reducing your trash by a lot. And it saves resources. So, you know, instead of sending these materials to the landfill where they will just sit and rot, we can bring them to a compost pile where they will then decompose and be recycled into this nutrient-rich fertilizer. When we use finished compost on our soil and in the land, we improve not only the soil nutrients, but also the soil structure, which can really help with reducing water runoff and am I blanking on the word here? What is it called when? Erosion, sorry, I had a total brain fart there. So it improves the soil structure and can help with water runoff and erosion. And it can also help with water filtration. So applying compost to land helps filter out toxins. So it can be used around different sites to help prevent harmful runoff. All right, and then lastly, we can reduce the climate change impact. So when organics are sent to a landfill, they give off the greenhouse gas methane, and that is a gas that is 25 to 28 times more harmful than CO2, which is what we typically think of as our main pollutant. That's what's given off of vehicles and transportation things when they're polluting. So when we send organics to the landfill, they don't have oxygen present, and that is why this methane byproduct is given off. That's what creates awful smells, and then it also contributes directly to climate change. However, when we compost and apply it to the land, it can do this magical process called carbon sequestration, which is pretty hard to pronounce. And I'm not going to go too into the scientific details of that. And I've got a few graphics coming up that kind of help explain this a little bit more. But basically, compost is able to take carbon out of the atmosphere and bring it down into the soil where it can be used by plants for growth and good purposes. And so we're actually reversing the effects of climate change. So taking carbon, which is a greenhouse gas, and can be cause of climate change, and bringing it down into the earth and the atmosphere to be stored and then also used for good, for plant growth. So we've got some graphics here from the ISLR, Institute of Local Self-Reliance. They are a great organization. If you are, at the end of this interested in more compost information, I would definitely suggest checking them out. They've got tons of free education and programming. So this is just a graphic that shows, how much, what is in our typical trash and how much can actually be composted. Trying to move this out of my way here. So this is information from 2018. So numbers have risen a little bit. This says about 21% of our trash is food scraps alone. I would say that number is closer to 30 at this point in time. We've got about 15% of trash that is paper or cardboard. again, which are things that can be composted if we want, if, you know, recycling wasn't an option. And if you don't know, recycling in this country is more leaning on the side of not happening. So composting items that can, paper products that can be composted is another great way to help recycle that material. We've got about 8% yard trimmings and then another 8% wood waste. So about 16% there is yard waste, which, you know, some of our townships compost for us. But if you're doing it in your yard, they can be a great source of ground material. So again, that's about 50% of our trash is actually able to be composted. Whether you want to do that in your home system or not is up to you. But it's just some food for thought that we can really be significantly decreasing what we send to the landfill if we started composting properly. And so this is just another graphic from the ISLR that talks about how compost is like that water filtration and helps with the erosion. And why that is because compost has a lot of organic matter in it. And what that organic matter does, so if you compare in comparison to dirt is dead. There's like almost no organic matter. It crumbles right in your hand and just like turns to dust. Where if you have healthy soil or compost, it's crumbly, it forms, it's thick, it's dense. And so compost has this awesome ability to absorb water, which is what that organic matter does. And so it can actually absorb up to 3 times more water than like depleted dead soil, which is why it's great for erosion. And which is another reason why when the water is filtering through, it can really absorb it and let good things go through the soil and kind of keep any like pollutants on the top of the soil. All right. Now we know why composting is good for us. We know what it is. And I just want to go over this one thing because it is the reason why there is so much confusion around composting. Sometimes people get really confused. What can be composted? What can't be composted? People are telling people different things. And it stems from this. Commercial composting and backyard composting are different things. In our backyards, we have to be a little bit more selective. It's going to take longer and it's gonna take our personal time and energy, which is all fine things, but you know, we're limited in what we can compost unless you are doing a really great job and keeping temperatures high. You're going to be limited on what you can put in your pile. And we'll kind of go over that in a little bit. We'll go over like what feedstocks we will want to put into our pile. But when we do commercial composting, it's done on a huge, large scale. Piles are ginormous. And it is operated and maintained on a regular basis by professionals who do this for a living. So they can accept more material than your backyard system, especially items that we wouldn't recommend, like compostable ware, meat products, dairy, oils, and manure. But whatever, you know, what's accepted at the compost site is up to the processor. So not all composting sites accept the same thing, which is where this confusion stems from. So we've got people who backyard compost and you're like, well, you know, this lemon rind should be compostable. It's natural, it's a food. However, we wouldn't recommend that in a backyard system because it takes longer to break down and can attract flies. But when we're doing a commercial composting site, easily accepted, won't have a hard time breaking down, temperatures are high, and will easily break that down. Some composting sites, you know, maybe they're smaller than others, they don't want to accept certain things. Some places don't accept certain compostable ware. I know for us, we compost at Linvilla Orchards. Our piles are huge, they get up to temperature, and there is something about compostable cutlery, so that corn plastic cutlery that says it's compostable, but it looks like plastic, it will not break down in our piles. It does not break down all the way. It gets jammed up in our machinery, so we don't accept it. That's like a specific situation with what we accept, but all different composting sites have their own rules and regulations, which is why there can be confusion about what is and what is not compostable. So it's always important to reach out to the processor for clarification, and in your own backyard, you're the processor, so you get to decide what you can and cannot compost. And so, like I said, like those last other differences with the commercial is that they maintain higher temperatures for a longer period of time, and then they go through that curing and screening process to make sure that they have a more stable finished product, because most likely they're selling that compost, so it's compost that you would see at a store and you would buy, or in your yard. You know, the material might look a little bit differently, but if you've created it yourself, you don't really care what it looks like. You can throw it in on your gardens and it will do just the same. All right, I'm about to go through the steps to set up your home compost bin, and I just want to put a reminder out there again. If you guys have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them into the chat. I will take a look at that at the end and answer any of your questions. All right, so step one, we've got, where are we putting this compost system? You don't want to have it right up next to your house if possible, because if something does go awry, it's better to have it a little bit more in your yard. And also, you know, compost piles, as you continue to compost, they grow and they get larger. So you might want it in a space where you can expand. So putting it in your yard, away from your house, but not too far, because you will have to go out there and tend to the pile and also add to it with your kitchen and food scraps on a regular basis. So picking up a spot in your yard that's not too far away. It's also good if the area is partially shaded, especially if you're going to be using a closed compost system like the one you see here in the image, because the sun can dry things out. So if it's in full sun, you would have to, you know, something you'd have to consider is also, like, is it close to a water source? You might have to water it on a regular basis. So getting some part shade can help avoid that. But you might want to consider having it close to a water source no matter what, so that you can, even ones that are partially shaded may need to be watered. So those are things to consider when choosing your location. You might also want to just like take into account some of the different things on your landscape. If your property is on a hill, you know, water is going to run down, so you may or may not want to put the compost at the bottom of the hill or the top of the hill, depending on what your access to water is. You know, if you didn't have access to water, put it at the bottom of the hill. Natural water will run down there. If you have access to water and you're concerned with things maybe getting over wet, put it at the top of the hill. So again, kind of depends on what your property looks like. And then we've got processing options. So we've got two different options that I'm going to lay out here for you. And as you compost, you're going to want to choose the processing option that aligns most with your composting goal. So if your goal is to get finished compost, usable compost to use in your yard, I would suggest batch processing. And I'll go over kind of what that means in a second. If you're composting just to kind of divert your waste from the landfill, you know, you just don't want to throw things into the trash. You're not super, you know, it'd be cool to get a finished compost, but you're not like dead set on using it and needing it. The slow as you go pile is probably the better option for you. And so the difference here is like add as you go pile, it's slower processing. It can take 3 to 8 months if you are maintaining it, but a lot of people who do add as you go kind of just like toss their things in there, let it go, and it could take longer to get a finished product, or you might never see a finished product if you're just like adding to it too slowly, which is fine. Again, like I said, if your end goal isn't to use finished compost and just to divert your materials, this is a great option for you. It takes minimal effort. You just kind of bring your materials out there, as you create them. So you can have like a little kitchen countertop compost bin, or even just like a bowl or container. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Fill it up with your food scraps and add to your compost pile as you create material. You don't have to stockpile as much for add as you go piles. And what I mean by stockpiling is you need to have a certain ratio of brown to green materials. And I'll go over kind of what that means. Again, that's coming up. But basically, our kitchen waste is a green material, high nitrogen, and then brown materials would be kind of more like yard waste. So fall leaves, cardboard, sawdust, wood chips would be brown waste, which you need a ratio of to compost properly. But if you're adding as you go, you don't need like a huge amount all at once. You can just kind of, if you have some shredded cardboard, if you have access to fall leaves, just sprinkle them on as you sprinkle in your food waste. The cons of this method is that it's a slow decomposition. Like I said, you may not get a finished product out of it. And then another con here is that if you're moving really slowly, materials, might not break down very fast, and it can be pests and rodents can be more attracted to that type of pile because there is more solid food scraps sitting in there for longer. They also can be prone to odor issues because typically if you're doing an add as you go pile, you're maintaining it less frequently, which can lead to aerobic states, which means no oxygen is present, which gives off that methane gas, which is what smells. So those are some cons of add as you go. However, if you are, maintaining it regularly and properly, you won't see those issues. For batch processing, like I said, this would be if your end goal is to get a finished compost product, like you want the compost, you want a batch compost. It will be a much faster process. You can get compost. They say 1 month, but I mean, to be realistic, I would say, home composters should expect 3 even to 5 months to get a finished product, which is still pretty fast. For comparison, at the farm, when we create compost, we do it in huge piles, but it's about almost a year for the finished product to be created after the screening process. But so the pros of a batch processing is that you get your finished product fast, and you will most likely get a finished compost if you are maintaining it properly. The cons here is that it requires really strategic planning for stockpiling. So you will need to have enough green and brown materials all at once to throw together. So you'll have to, save your food scraps for a while, whether that means freezing them or like just keeping them in a bin. It might get a little gross if you're not keeping it temperature controlled. And then you'll need to have access to a lot of brown material, the fall leaves, cardboard, wood chips, whatever you choose to use. And then you will need to actively be maintaining it while this is happening. So regular turning, regular watering, you won't be adding to it. So it is, limiting. You can't just like kind of add as you go because it's all going to be breaking down at once. And if you keep adding to it, you won't see a finished product. So these are our 2 processing options. And then once you've decided on like kind of your compost goal and which processing option you're going to do, you can choose your bin. So again, some processing options work better for certain bins or systems. So if you wanted to batch process, tumblers are a really easy way to go. You can just fill them up and they make turning easy. They normally have a hand crank or you can just push them. So they're a really good option for batch processing. It's closed, so you less worry about animals and rodents. But a con there is that you do, with the batch processing, you have to stop adding materials at some point to let the material decompose fully. So people who have tumblers often choose to have 2, one for active composting and then one for adding to. Another closed bin system would be, like you see in the photo there, just a stand-up bin that just has plastic on the sides to, again, help with pest migration And another pro here is that it enables continuous composting. So you can see on this bin, there's kind of those flaps down at the bottom. So if you're composting correctly, finished compost can be coming out the bottom, and as you're adding to the top, your more active composting is happening at the top of the bin there. A con here, like I said before, is that especially if it's in a sunny spot, you will need to actively water your materials here, because it's a closed bin. It's not letting natural rainfall or moisture in, so you will have to water it as you're composting, because the compost and the microbes need water to create that decomposition. I have a note here about checking with your township about what types of compost systems are permitted in your area. A lot of suburban areas and urban areas require closed systems to help with the mitigation of pests. They don't want to aid to any of that. And I know Haverford Township is one of those areas where you do need to have a closed system. Obviously, these aren't like tightly regulated, but it is good to know. And then here I've got a slide on Haverford Township in particular, if you are a resident, does have these closed systems for sale. They are for sale for $30, and that is much cheaper than the marketplace value. You can see bins like this for up to $100 to $200, depending on which one you're looking at. So if you live in Haverford Township and are attending this workshop, you can reach out. You can see that email there, havecompost@gmail, and can inquire about getting one of these for yourself. And so this presentation is being recorded, so you can always, if you don't write this down right now, you can always come back to the presentation and get this information. And then I'm just going to go over open systems real quick. So these are, people, I feel like when they think composting, they typically see these. They're more like community composting style. They're much larger than these closed bins typically. I mean, you could create them smaller, but typically people use pallets, as you can see, which are pretty big. Or there's the simple chicken wire assembly where you can just get some stakes, stake them down, and then kind of hammer some chicken wire around it. Those are really easy to assemble and good at keeping in the material, and they kind of blend right into your yard, so it's not an eyesore if that's something you're concerned about. A con with both of these options are that they have a greater risk of pest and rodent infestation because they are not closed off with plastic. When you build these types of systems, we always suggest using, there's what's called a steel mesh that you can get for the bottom of compost piles to help prevent, if you're really concerned about rodents, I would say for sure, get the mesh, put it at the bottom, and also you can always line the sides as well. If you're super concerned or already having an issue, that would be something to consider. But we always suggest starting the bottom of your compost pile, whether it's an open system like this. Even the ground bins that are closed tend to have an open bottom. Putting a layer of that down, just as a preventative measure. It's always good to be on the defense, because once you have to play offensively, it can get tough. And it can just, people get low morale. They want to give up on composting, and that's not what we want. So these are our options. We got open systems, closed systems. And then step 3, we got to prepare for the pile. So we're going to go over feedstocks, that brown and green material, in a second. But before we do that, I've got here on the slide talking about that rodent resistant mesh. Again, we strongly recommend it for any open system. And then for those closed bins that have an open bottom, always recommend using that. You won't regret it. Another thing is getting beneficial microbes into your pile immediately. So to start a compost pile, we suggest putting down a layer of finished compost. It's got tons of great microbes in there and fungi. So once you start adding to it, those microbes are there. They're already going to start doing their things. Where if you started kind of clean slate, there's always microbes on everything that we touch, but maybe not the ones that we want or the ones that we need for the decomposition. So we always suggest a good layer of compost at the bottom of your pile. If you're using a tumbler, throwing just a good scoop or two of compost in there can just help kickstart that decomposition process. I've talked a lot about stockpiling brown materials. No matter what compost processing or what system you're using, we need brown materials. So it's always good to keep them handy, whether you are shredding up newspaper, whether you're keeping, cardboard boxes from deliveries and shredding them up, whether you're stockpiling fall leaves in some sort of container over the winter. It's best to have a plan and an idea of how you can keep brown materials handy, especially during the spring and summer months, where there's an increase of green materials, especially if you're composting grass clippings. They are super high in nitrogen, which is great, but you would need to offset that with a lot of brown material in order to keep things active and not go aerobic. I've already talked a good bit about watering piles, so I'm not going to go too much more into that. It's just, again, something to consider as you're preparing to get composting. And then the last thing is just making sure you have the right tools. You don't need anything fancy. There's these nice compost aerators, which you can purchase. They're not super expensive. However, if you already have a pitchfork, a garden hoe, or a shovel, you can pretty much do the job. It might take a little bit more back labor, but if you don't need to purchase something new, you don't need to. Compost aerators are kind of like a large corkscrew. They can make it easy. And especially for those closed bins, it can be hard to get a shovel or a pitchfork in there. So the compost aerators can be nice, but again, not necessary. So taking all these things into consideration before you start will set you up for success when it's time to actually start composting. And so this is like the main information that a lot of people feel like they need when starting composting is what goes in there. Like I've mentioned before, we've got the browns and the greens. And so to break that down again, green material, nitrogen rich. Brown material, carbon rich. When we talk about composting, we need a ratio of both. So it's about a 2 to 3 or 1 to 3 ratio of, you want 1 part green to 2 or 3 parts brown material. And that's for multiple reasons. Our green materials are typically wet, they're high in nitrogen, they can be odorous, they can attract pests. So pairing it with the higher ratio of brown materials ensures that we're getting a good amount of dry also materials into the pile to help wick up some of that moisture. Brown materials typically have more structure to them. So think about wood, cardboard, it's a little bit more structured, where like a vegetable scrap is very flimsy. So it keeps structure, which allows airflow through the pile. And the carbon material itself can act as an air filter. So when adding to a pile, we always suggest covering with a layer of brown materials. And that's because it acts as a biofilter. So basically the carbon will keep things in and will allow air and water to go through, but doesn't allow, kind of the other way for odors and such. So it acts as a biofilter. It could be helpful when composting. So our green materials, like I said, mostly food scraps. We've got fruits, vegetables, lawn and flower clippings, coffee grounds, and tea bags. There are a few exceptions when we talk about backyard composting that you would want to avoid. To name a few, I would say specifically you want to avoid citruses. And if you do want to compost citruses, cutting them up super finely when adding them to your pile, because super tough rinds, as you can imagine, are harder to break down than like a peel of a carrot. We've also got to be concerned about seeds. So like think an avocado seeds, super dense and hard. You're going to be composting them. It may not break down fully unless you cut it up or kind of smash it up beforehand. So those are things to consider when adding, food waste to your pile. And then what we don't want to add when we think about food is no meat, no seafood, no dairy, and no cooked foods. Again, that is specifically for home composters. Until you've mastered the composting process with just fruit and veggie scraps, I would not recommend adding any of those products into your home pile. They will attract rodents, they will attract bugs, they will give off odors, and can lead to just a messy situation. If you are composting commercially, all of those items can be composted. But again, for our backyard compost specifically, you want to avoid that kind of stuff. Lawn and flower clippings are a great add. Like I said, grass clippings, super high in nitrogen. A great way if you want to batch process to get a ton of nitrogen all at once. Mow your lawn, collect the scraps, and throw it in. Great way to give you a bulk of nitrogen. However, things that you want to be considerate of. If you've got weeds going on, you don't want to add weed seeds to your compost pile because most likely your piles won't get high enough to kill them. And then if they're in your finished product and you spread that on your lawn or your garden beds, you may be spreading the seeds of weeds, which we don't want. Definitely something home composters, I think that's a large thing we see sometimes. So you want to be really considerate of that. I tend to tell people not to add weeds to their home compost system at all, or create a fully separate pile for them to kind of decompose. Another option would be to put them into a bin or something and let them fully dry out and die before you add them to your pile. And in which case then they're technically a brown then. So once things turn from green to brown, they move from nitrogen rich to carbon rich. And I'm going to stop myself right there because I just had a light bulb. Something I forgot to mention is that all of these materials have both nitrogen and carbon in them. It's just which one's more predominant. So everything's got carbon and nitrogen in them. However, brown materials are carbon rich, so they have more carbon, and green materials are nitrogen rich. They have more nitrogen. So that is an important thing that kind of can confuse people sometimes. So I just wanted to clear that up. And then we've got coffee grounds and tea bags. So coffee grounds, great nitrogen product. Oftentimes, coffee filters are compostable, so you can throw them right in. Tea bags are the same, except for you have to be aware. Sometimes tea bags these days are synthetic. So you'd want to just make sure it's one of those natural bags. And you also want to make sure that it doesn't have a staple in it, because obviously the metal there is not compostable. All right. For our brown materials, like I've been saying, we've got fall leaves, shredded paper, newspaper, shredded cardboard. Egg cartons are a great one, not the styrofoam ones. Those are awful. We can't even recycle those. But cardboard, egg cartons, sawdust is a great add for backyard piles because it's already finely ground up, and it's a great source of carbon, acts as a great biofilter, really easy to lighter in. Eggshells, corn stalks, however, those are carbon rich. However, again, those can be difficult to add into a home pile because we do see that they take a longer time to break down. So again, kind of gauging your own compost system, see how it works for you. Do you want to add that material or not? I always recommend chopping that stuff up pretty fine before adding it if you don't want to see it in your finished product. You can add branches, but again, the larger they are, the longer it's going to take to break down, and it may not break down in your home system. So being careful there, making sure it's small twigs only, or really cutting things up. Straw is a great add that breaks down typically, and even if it doesn't break down fully, if you're using compost as kind of a a top layer to your garden beds, straw is a great weed can be great at suppressing weeds. So straw is a great add, and conifer needles are pretty small. They tend to break down easily and are abundant in this area to stockpile. All right, step 5, tips for adding materials. So now we know what we can add. And then before we add it, we just want to take some things into consideration. So I've been saying these things all along, but we want to break materials up. So I said that with some of those harder to decompose items, if you want to add them, you would want to cut them up first. And think about it this way. If you have one broccoli stalk, microorganisms and worms and things like that can only access it from the outside. But if you cut that up into a bunch of pieces, the surface area increases. So they can access that and start eating it and decomposing it from so much more area than if you had it all in one piece. So think about that with any item you're adding into your compost. The more you break it up, the quicker it's going to decompose. You've helped it along in the journey. You've gotta keep that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So again, a 2 to 3, 1 to 3 ratio. If you're doing batch processing, you can make it a little bit closer to a 1 to 1 ratio, but again, the more carbon, pretty much the better, especially when it comes to home composting. So you need both to do it properly, but having the right mix is what will make sure you have a successful composting pile. And then, like I just already mentioned, always covering a pile with a layer of brown materials to help act as a biofilter. And also, we live in an area where it can rain a lot. We can get winter precipitation. Covering materials with a brown layer will help wake up moisture so things don't get too wet, because just like us, our microorganisms can kind of like drown out, and we don't want that either. We want to keep them happy and healthy, because they are really doing all of the decomposition. We are just aiding them in that process. And then turning. So once we've added our materials, we need to maintain them, and the best way to do that is by turning them. So we need to continue to give our microbes air. So you turn things, again, like I said, you can get a compost aerator, you can use a pitchfork or a shovel, turning your materials around. One, it mixes things up. We kind of get browns and greens mixing. We get oxygen in there. And we can move water around. If things are really wet, the water is going to go to the bottom. So if we turn things around, we just had a big rain, maybe we want to wait a day and then turn materials so that things can dry out a little bit. Because again, it's all about these proper ratios. We don't want things too wet. We don't want things too dry. They say the typical consistency is if you could pick materials up and kind of squeeze it, you want it to be the consistency of like a wrung out dish sponge. You don't want it to be sopping wet, but you don't want it to be too dry. When we're home composting, temperature does matter, especially when we live in an area where it can get super cold. So 60 degrees or higher, we want to be turning our pile on a regular basis. It doesn't have to be daily, but you want to be pretty regular about it, just setting yourself a schedule. And if the pile itself is steamy and hot, you want to be turning it regular. Like I said, on a home compost system, unless you're like super gung-ho composting, you won't really see super high temperatures. When we move into the colder months, you want to turn it less frequently because you want to keep heat and temperatures in, because that's what helps with the breakdown. So once we hit fall, maybe lessing, turning maybe once a week or every other week, depending on, your schedule. And then once things get below freezing, there's no need to break your back and try and figure out how to turn this material that's likely frozen. What happens to compost in the winter is that it basically goes dormant. Microorganisms kind of die off. Things freeze together. You don't have issues with smells if everything is frozen. So we typically tell people to kind of close up their compost pile over the winter. And then once things begin to thaw out in the summer, microorganisms naturally come back and your compost thaws, and there you go. You just give it a good turn and it's back to life. Already said turning, or no, we already talked about adding brown material after adding new material, but once you add new material, you can also always turn it as well, give it a good aeration. The mix of nutrients will affect how long materials take to break down. So this is just kind of talking about pile diversity. If you're adding the same material over and over again, it may take a little bit longer to break down because you've only got the same thing in there with the same nitrogen or carbon ratio. Or if you've got a good mix of foods going on, it will tend to break down quicker. All right, pile problems. I'm going to try and wrap up quick here because we're getting close to the time, and I see there's a bunch of questions in the chat. So I've kind of been hitting on this stuff throughout again, but typical problems we have home composters ask are pile smells. Why is this happening? High nitrogen content, too much food, not enough browns. So to solve this issue, you would want to add tons of carbon material and aerate on a regular basis until you notice the smell goes away. Some people complain that they don't get a finished compost product and the pile is just kind of sitting there. It doesn't really seem like it's decomposing. Few things can be happening. One, you might not have a lot of material, so temperatures aren't high enough. So the suggestion would be to bulk up your pile using tons of carbon and easy nitrogen products. Like I said, like if you collect your grass clippings, easy way to bulk up a pile. Another thing is that the ratios can be off. So if things aren't happening, if you've got too much carbon material, if you've just got a pile of leaves, that will break down eventually, but it's just so much, it's so carbon rich that it will take so long, like you don't have enough nitrogen going on. You also might be off on your water and oxygen ratio. So you might need to add water if things aren't wet enough. Again, our microorganisms need a drink just like us. You might have to water your pile. You might have to turn it. So there are some things to consider if you notice your pile is not doing anything, but just really thinking about those 5 key factors and making sure that things are in a balance. And then the most concerned pile problem would be bugs and rodents. Bugs are pretty normal. And like I've been talking about this whole time, microorganisms, we can't really see them, but there are things like worms. People don't like flies, but honestly, they are helpful in the decomposition process. Centipedes, spiders, mites, all of those things, they eat these material. They decompose it naturally. So bugs are pretty normal to see. I wouldn't get too concerned. People can get a little weary about maggots because we as a society don't like them. However, they are like the fastest decomposers out there. We might not like to see them, but they do the job. So if you don't want to see them on your pile, you got to maintain it more regularly. But if you go out there and you see them, don't be too alarmed. They're not going to do any harm to your pile. And when it comes to rodents, squirrels and chipmunks, they might get interested in your pile for a second, but they're not really going to linger much. And they won't pose a threat. In this area, I know people say deer get attracted to their pile. Again, they're not so much of a threat. They may eat a good amount of your material. So again, depending on what your end goal is, if you want finished compost, you might want to put fencing around or close your pile off to avoid that from happening. The most concerning rodents would be mice and rats. They can infest piles, and when that happens, it's really hard to get rid of them, which is why, again, we suggest starting with that rodent-resistant mesh to avoid that from happening. But typically when that happens, we basically have to break down piles and start over again, which is unfortunate, but it is it's really a serious amount of effort if that happens to your pile to kind of deter them and get them out of there. So that's why keeping proper ratios and maintaining your pile is important, because if things are breaking down well and you're turning things regularly, animals can't create a home in your pile, and it won't won't have smells, won't have odors, won't be attracting them. So it's really about maintaining your pile, keeping proper ratios, and these issues should not occur. If you are composting properly, you won't see any of these issues. It happens from time to time. We are human, you know, we're busy. If you're composting at home, awesome job. Maybe you forgot about it one week. Things can happen. You know, don't beat yourself up. Things are normally reversible and fixable. And then lastly here, we've got our what to do with finished compost. So there's many ways we can use compost. Typical applications would be for the spring season. So what we're going in now for planting and creating seedlings. We typically recommend layering garden beds with anywhere from a 1/2 inch to a 3-inch layer of compost. It gives it a good amendment so that as things grow throughout the seasons, nutrients trickle down into the root system and help them grow faster. You can also apply compost mid-season to give things a good boost. And then we also can apply compost before the fall frost to just kind of ensure that our soil has just some more organic matter in it, and it will provide nutrients for when things thaw out in spring again. I do want to mention that compost tea is a really cool option for home composters, especially if you're not creating a lot of compost. Might not be worth it for you to spread it everywhere, but if you create a compost tea, which is similar to creating, you know, making a regular cup of tea, you steep the compost in water. You got to aerate it, so giving a good turn. And there's a few different ways to do this, which I won't get too into, but great YouTube resources on this. Creating a compost tea is a great way to make your compost go farther. You can water your plants with it, water your lawn. It's a good option for home composters, I think. And then all plants love compost. Put in your gardens, put in your trees, your shrubs, your house plants can even take compost. I just did that with my house plants. They're all very happy. So anything that grows likes compost. So summing it up, I just want to say again, those ratios, crucial. Home composters often, you know, we kind of say create a compost lasagna. Layers of green, layer of brown, layer of green, layer of brown, to help make sure that you're maintaining that ratio. So let me pop up the chat here, check out some of these questions. All right, we've got Joy Baxter with just a comment here that Haverford Township waste goes to the Chester County incinerator and not a landfill, which is true, but not sure if you guys know, things burned in an incinerator, those ashes have to go somewhere and they end up going to a landfill. So while your waste doesn't technically go straight to a landfill, it does eventually kind of die there. Sorry. All right, Joy Baxter had to sign off. She said, please contact her at the Haverford Compost if you have any questions. Thanks, Joy. Which website will tonight's presentation be posted to? I am not positive about that because I am just the presenter, but I would think on the Haverford EAC website.
So I will send everyone the link. I actually put it on YouTube.
Okay.
And I'll send everyone the link, anyone who registered.
Great.
Thanks.
So you get this all in your inbox. Megan asked, what's the ratio of green to brown? Could have been in the beginning of the presentation, but it is 1 to 2 parts green to 3 parts brown. So we always want more brown than green. Just to clarify, if you are using a tumbler to batch process, you eventually should stop adding matter, but continue to turn. Is that correct? Renee, that is correct. So with a tumbler, you want to add material, and once it gets full, you'll need to continue turning it. They say in tumblers, anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks, material should fully break down if you're maintaining it on a regular basis. What you will need to add though is water, most likely. So while you should stop adding feedstocks, water is good for tumblers, especially, you know, they're closed systems. They're not letting natural stuff in. But yeah, you will have to eventually take a break from adding materials, because if you don't, you know, you'll have almost finished compost and then you'll like throw in a banana peel and then you've got like this banana peel chilling in almost finished compost. Where do you recommend buying the compost pile? I am a newbie. So if you're talking about the bin, if you live in Haverford Township, those clothes bins that they sell, like I said, are way cheaper than anything you can get online. I fully recommend doing that. It's also just like way to interact with the community. Other options, you know, I see them at local hardware stores more and more. And then there's Natural Garden Supply, I think, sells composters. Really, you can just kind of Google that. I've only ever built compost piles with like reclaimed materials, so either pallets or the chicken wire. So I don't have a personal recommendation on the closed systems. But I'm sure, you know, online, you know, you can find a product that's good for you. Yeah, sorry for not having a better recommendation on that. Is that the last question? Oh. Yeah, that was the last question. Thank you, very informative. Thank you, Terry. So I got one more slide here. Just to kind of shout out, again, I'm from Mother Compost. We make composting easy and simple. If you have finished this presentation and you're like, home composting, not for me, check out our curbside collection options. We give you a bucket and make it easy. And if you are into home composting, we also have an online option that gives coaching availability. So if you have personalized questions, we have a compost coach where you can come and book sessions with me or our other coaches for professional advice. And we have a more in-depth home composting course, which goes over kind of the basics we covered here and more to get home composters in a successful journey in their home compost experiment. So here's our contact information. You can go to mothercompost.com, compost coach at mothercompost.com, info@mothercompost.com, and you'll have my email maybe from these slides. So just want to throw that out there and say thank you for everyone for coming out tonight and taking time to learn about composting.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think we all learned a lot tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, I'm Eileen Matola from Haverford Township Recreation Department, and I will be sending out the link to this presentation. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Tiffany from Mother Compost.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Eileen.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.